Aysha has just published her book, Our Symphony with Animals, which shows why our relationship with animals matter. I'm very happy that you today will give a bit of a sneak peek on it, because Aysha will present on why and how our empathy for animals is vital to our well-being. Thank you so much for being here, Aysha.
This is my baby. This is Silos. I love him. I just love animals. And we all do, don't we? We all love being with animals. And you might say that, yeah, Aysha, that's because we here are animal people. But in fact, it's part of our biology. In the 1980s, biologist Edward Wilson had coined the word biophilia, which means it describes our innate human desire to connect with other living beings. And that includes plants, that includes insects. But I believe it's in our relationships with animals where our biophilia is especially evident. More and more households throughout the world are now including animals as part of their families. And when we can't bring animals into our home, we seek them elsewhere. We join bird watching clubs, we go on safaris, we visit wildlife parks and sanctuaries. And as much as I hate animals in circuses and zoos, part of the very reason why they exist in the first place is because we have this innate desire to see other animals, to connect with other animals. In fact, our desire to connect with other animals is so strong that our biology isn't just biophilia, it's animalphilia. And I'll go even further. I know this is incredibly hard to believe, knowing what we face day to day, but humans have an innate capacity to empathize with animals. And it comes out sometimes in some people in the most unlikely of situations, sometimes in the most unlikely of people. We'll see this from time to time when we see people go out of their way and sometimes risk their lives to help animals in need. And it doesn't matter how dangerous the situation is, like this boy who waded a flood to rescue this deer. It doesn't matter who the animal is. These guys are rescuing this pig who was stranded on a rooftop after a hurricane. And it doesn't matter how small the animal is. This is a firefighter who rescued and is now giving oxygen to a hamster. It doesn't matter if we're rich or poor, if we live in a palace or if we live on the streets. Animals capture our hearts, our imagination, our wonder, like no one else can. And as a neurologist, I find myself asking, where does this empathy for animals come from? And how does it affect our well-being, not just as individuals, but collectively as a society? So in 1946, the World Health Organization had described health as more than just the absence of disease, but described health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. In other words, health draws from every part of our lives. And in a sense, each of us is like a connect-the-dot picture. And in order to draw the right picture of health, you have to A, include all the relevant dots that make up our lives, and B, connect those dots in the right way. So in medicine, we know that how we govern ourselves, how we shelter ourselves, how we share or do not share our resources, how we relate to our environment, how we eat, how we work, how we play. In other words, how we live influences our health. Despite knowing this, medicine has largely overlooked one crucial influence that has existed since our beginning: our relationships with animals. So I wanted to change this. So for 5 years, I traveled around the United States exploring how do our relationships with animals affect our physical, mental, and social well-being. And in particular, I asked, what do we gain when we embrace empathy for animals, and what do we lose when we don't? So to begin, studies show that just being with animals can improve our health in ways that we can physically measure. Animals can lower our blood pressure, lower our baseline heart rate, and lower our cholesterol level. And these can have cumulative effects over time that can increase our lifespans. I know many of you have probably felt these effects yourself. When you walk in your front door at the end of a stressful day at work, and your little critter runs up to greet you, don't you just immediately feel your blood pressure dropping? And animals also can boost positive neurochemicals, like oxytocin and dopamine. These are neurochemicals that help us feel good. And what's interesting, we see these same boosts in the animals themselves. So there is a mutual positive effect for being in these respectful, kind relationships with animals. Now, the effects animals have on us go beyond those that we can physically measure. In the 1950s, Dr. Boris Levinson, a psychiatrist, had a profound insight. He was asked by a desperate mother to see a young boy who months before had suddenly stopped talking, and the boy became withdrawn. And the mother had taken the boy from psychologist to psychiatrist, and no one could get through to the boy. And Dr. Levinson agreed to go ahead and see the boy. Well, Dr. Levinson happened to be an animal lover, and he rescued dogs and cats all the time. And he would keep one of his dogs, or many of his dogs, in his office with him. And on the first visit with the boy, Jingles, his dog Jingles, was there. And when the boy walked into the office, Jingles did what Jingles often did. Jingles ran to the boy and licked his face. And this is where Dr. Levinson saw something amazing. Because rather than shirking away from the dog, the boy wrapped his arms around the dog and said the first words he had uttered in almost a year. And he said, "Hello." And Dr. Levinson noticed that the boy continued to improve in Jingles' presence. And he noticed this with a variety of kids with many different types of animals. And he had suggested that animals can be co-therapists. Sigmund Freud also noticed this. Sigmund Freud used to keep his beloved dog, Jofi, his Chow Chow, in his office to help him, Freud, relax when he was seeing patients. But he quickly noticed how the Jofi's presence helped his patients relax, and they were more likely to open up and talk with him. Animals seem to provide a comfort and a companionship that is unique. And that's because they're not humans. And thank God for that. They help us step away from the human-generated pressures in our lives. They help us step away from the cruelties, the hardships, the disappointments we face in our lives, and to see the beauty and the joys in the world. This little guy, this little rat, is being tickled. Do you guys know that rats love to be tickled? And they will run to the hand when they know that you're going to tickle them, and they will emit an ultrasonic chirping noise. They laugh when they are being tickled. Now, I'm showing you this photo that I've shown to lots of different people, lots of different audiences. And it's just a photo. You see this little guy, you see his little feet, his little hands up in the air. You know he's being tickled. You know he's experiencing joy in this moment. And you're sharing, even just for a moment, you are sharing that joy with this rat. Everyone I show this photo with shares that joy, even for a moment. That is our innate empathy. That's a result of our empathy for this rat. And this is just a photo. So animals can remind us about the joy in the world. They can teach us joy. And in addition to teaching us joy, animals can even teach us empathy itself, even among the most violent of men and women. This is the Ohio State Penitentiary for the Criminally Insane. It was built in the 1900s in the state of Ohio, in the United States. It is the second largest poured concrete structure in the world after the Pentagon. It's also one of the most notoriously brutal institutions in American history. And for decades after it was built, rumors spread about the brutal treatment of the inmates. But it wasn't until the 1970s that 3 reporters went undercover and they brought to light this treatment of the inmates. And after that undercover investigation, there were many reforms at the institution. But there was one in particular that caught nationwide attention. And pretty soon, reporters from ABC News, National Geographic, Time Magazine were flocking to the institution to report not on the brutal treatment of the inmates, but to report on the work of this person. And this is David Lee. He was a sociologist at the institution. And David decided to try something new as part of a reform. Knowing how much animals have brightened his life, he wondered if bringing animals into the ward could brighten the lives of the inmates. Remember, this was the 1970s. So what he did is he started with a 60-day trial period. So he brought animals, fish in tanks and birds, into two of the wards that housed the most suicidal and depressed inmates. And for 60 days, he tracked their progress and compared them with the progress of inmates on two identical wards in the patient makeup and the staffing, but those wards did not have animals. And almost immediately, David saw results. The inmates would run to greet visitors and say, "Come on, you have to come meet my fish," or "You have to come meet my birds." And after 60 days, the results were irrefutable. In the test ward, where there are animals, they had, the inmates were able to cut their medication use by half. They had far fewer violent outbreaks, and they had no suicide attempts. In the comparison ward, the inmates stayed on the same level of medication, same high level of violent outbreaks, and they had 8 suicide attempts during those 60 days. And then with this success, David expanded the program both inside and outside. And over time, he started to bring in more animals who are in need of rescue, as opposed to just buying animals from pet shops. He brought in animals who were homeless. And this allowed the inmates to feel that they were saving these animals in addition to saving themselves. And the bond that formed among so many of these inmates and the animals was incredibly strong. There was one man who it became time for his discharge. He was a man who had a very troublesome past. And when it came time for discharge, he refused. What happened was that he had bonded very strongly with a tank of angelfish. And he would put his hand into the tank, and the fish would only swim up to his hand. No one else's, just his hand. And when time came for him to be discharged, he actually refused to go unless he could take the fish with him. And fortunately, that wish was granted, and many other inmates then started making the same demand and demanding that these animals go home with them. So, you have to understand, these were very violent people. These were people convicted of crimes like rape, armed robbery, and murder. And when the reporters were coming out to meet them, these folks, these inmates, were telling the reporters, "For the first time, I feel patience. I feel a sense of kindness. I understand animals. I understand that we need to stop hurting them. And I'm learning patience through the animals." These inmates were actually learning empathy by being with these animals. And this was the first successful documented animal therapy program in a U.S. prison institution. And it might be in the world as well, the first in the world. But just as empathy can be learned, it can also be unlearned. Despite this innate capacity to empathize with animals, we can also cause immense cruelty in animals. So in the middle part of the book, I wanted to start exploring why. How do we allow this to happen? So I started with an extreme. This is Keith Jesperson. He is serving life at the Oregon State Penitentiary for murdering 8 women. I think it's pretty common knowledge, at least in the United States, and I think maybe here in Denmark as well, that murderers, violent killers like serial killers, often start out by abusing animals. What has not really been studied, though, and really explored is why. How do they start abusing animals? So I reached out to Keith Jesperson. I wanted to really go into detail with him and explore his history. And so for a year, we spent conversing over phone calls, through letters, and ultimately I went to visit him at the institution. The thing about Jesperson is he didn't come out of the womb being cruel to animals. He didn't come out seeing animals as targets of his violence. He actually showed surprising moments of empathy for animals, and it came out when he was talking with me. He especially had it when he was a child, when he talked about how he tried to rescue certain animals. But what ultimately happened was that nascent empathy was crushed by his surrounding culture, which was his neighbors, his friends, his family, and especially his father. And even Keith he recognized how that happened, that he actually wrote a letter to the editor protesting a cat killing, showing how he became who he was because of his his learned ability to see animals as targets for violence, and that we need to take this kind of violence seriously. But of course, Keith Jesperson is an extreme. He's an outlier in the full spectrum of violence. Most violence against animals links more strongly, not with the Keith Jespersons in the world, but with more common crimes, the more everyday crimes. And this is something I learned when I spent 4 days riding along with the New York Police Department. So Denmark and Niels is far ahead, much further ahead than the United States here. But in the United States, the NYPD is ahead of its time because they have the first ever squad of detectives focused solely on investigating crimes against animals. And that is a big deal because there was no other in the United States. This is me in a very oversized bulletproof vest, which is the norm there in America. This is America, so people are large. So the NYPD knows what the studies show, right? They know that the people who tend to have found to abuse animals tend to be the same people who are arrested for violence against their spouses, child abuse, human trafficking, gang warfare, armed robbery, you name it. And that link is so strong and so irrefutable that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, recently made changes in how it tracks animal abuse. It used to consider animals as the other category. That meant that they didn't really track it very well. But a few years ago, they moved animal abuse to the A category, meaning that it tracks animal abuse the way it tracks murder. This is a significant change. However, despite this great progress with the NYPD and the FBI, they're still missing one crucial thing, which we all know, is that most abuse of animals doesn't occur by rogue killers like Keith Jesperson or by violent spouses, but most animal abuse occurs at the hands of industry and government. In fur farms, factory farms, puppy mills, laboratories. These are photos I took recently of some tours in factory farms in Oklahoma. We have allowed, as a society, our governments and our industries to hurt animals in this way. And we have told them, go ahead and hurt animals, we'll just look the other way. But we don't just stop there. We have to think the other way as well. In order to suppress that empathy for animals, we have to think the other way. And words matter. They don't just reflect how we think, they influence how we think. So as Maria had pointed out earlier, that in order to separate ourselves from animals and to feel easier with what's happening to animals, we now divide animals into categories and we attach a label to them. So we have food animals, lab animals, fur animals, companion animals, wild animals. And studies show that just that one word, that one label, can dramatically affect our empathy for those animals. And it describes the narrative that we give to those animals. So if I tell someone, if I'm talking about a companion cat, the story people think is that this is an animal who is part of a household, part of a family, meant to be loved. If I talk about a lab cat, well, this cat was born and bred to be used in experiments, bred to have electrodes implanted in her brain and to have her spinal cord crushed. But we don't just even stop there with categories, because now as a society we're starting to know these animals a little bit more and more every day. So to further remove who animals are, we slice and dice them into their parts. Chickens, turkeys, pigs are now thighs, wings, nuggets, bacon, ribs. Or we rename animals altogether. Animals in laboratories are called systems, preparations, tools, or models. So our truths about animals are a creation of language. We've divided animals into separate categories. We break animals down into their parts, or we reduce them into abstractions, all to ease our conscience. Does it really work? And as with individual forms of violence against animals, when we allow our industries and government to cause this type of violence against animals, does that come out to hurt us? Well, in the United States, it's been noted for quite some time that when a slaughterhouse moves into town, there was a rapid rise in violent crimes. And sociologists had often pointed to many different causes, and they usually say that it's because of the brutal nature of the work, which is true, or the cruel treatment of the slaughterhouse employees, which is also true. But one sociologist had a different idea. And Dr. Fitzgerald thought that she wondered if the act of actually killing thousands, and sometimes thousands of animals a day, could impact this increase in crime rate. It's amazing that no one else had thought about looking at this before. So what she did is she looked at 600 counties in the United States. And she looked at the counties where there are slaughterhouses. And she looked at their crime rates. And she compared them to the counties that didn't have slaughterhouses, but had industries that were similar in the way the employees were treated and in the dangerous nature of the work. And what she found was an irrefutable link between crime and slaughterhouses that she did not find with the other industries. She especially found a strong link between the slaughterhouses and violence against women and children. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? We're going to target the most vulnerable, the most powerless. She found that a slaughterhouse of 175 employees more than doubled the crime rate. This was an example of violence that's considered legal, a legal form of violence that spills over into the larger society. So in other words, what her study suggests is that violence towards animals, even in these normalized, industrialized, legalized ways, does spill over, and it causes harm to us as well. But the good news is that the same studies that show us how we suppress empathy can also give us clues to how to regain that. And imaging and other studies show that we are more likely to empathize with others, and this is animals or humans. We're more likely to have empathy for those who are more like us, for those who are physically nearer to us, and for those whom we are more familiar with. And I know this gets back to many of the questions and discussions we've had earlier today, but it's vital to not only show the suffering of animals, but to show who these animals are at their best. So it's vital to keep showing these photos of rats being tickled, videos of mice showing empathy, and of hens stretching their wings to protect their babies from the rain. The more people become to know these animals, the more that kernel of empathy that may have been hidden deep down within can emerge. As it did for Stephen Peterson, who was a hunter. He was a hunter all his life, and he never once questioned his practice until one day he found himself crawling across a frozen river to rescue this deer who was trapped in an ice hole in the middle of the ice. That empathy emerged for the first time in James Giuliani. James was a mobster for the Gambino family, and he lived a life of violence and pettiness, selfishness, never cared about animals, saw them as nuisances. But one day he came across an abused dog. And what happened was that there was a rapid rise in empathetic anger, which is a very powerful form of empathy. And James was angry at the thought that someone could abuse and hurt such a little animal. And that led to remarkable change. James gave up alcohol and drugs, which he was formerly addicted to, and he's been alcohol and drug-free for more than 10 years. He changed his life around. Now he devotes his life to rescuing animals and going around the country teaching children kindness towards animals. That empathy emerged for the first time in Tommy and Renee King-Sonnen, a cattle rancher and a cattle rancher's wife, former cattle rancher and former cattle rancher's wife. They had a cattle ranch in order to supplement their retirement income. They never once thought about the cows. They bred the cows and then sold their babies who went off for slaughter or for further breeding. And, they were just a form of income for Tommy and Renee. But then one day, Renee was asked to hand feed a sickly calf. And as she said, once she did, she went through a rabbit hole, and she came out, she suddenly started to see these animals for who they were. And she saw that when the trailer came to take the babies away, the mothers would follow the trailer as far as they could along the fence line, crying and screaming after their babies. And Tommy and Renee, this is in Texas now, have formed the first ever animal sanctuary from a former cattle ranch in the United States. And the ranch is home, or the sanctuary now is home to beautiful creatures like Pepper, who is a beautiful photogenic goat. It is home to beautiful animals like Charger on the left. I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to see this, but I did. I was there when they brought Charger. Charger was rescued, and he arrived when I was there for the first time. And he came on a trailer from a long travel, and he was on wobbly legs when he stepped out of the trailer, and he was very unsure of himself. And so he stepped out of the trailer, and he started mooing tentatively, and then he started mooing with more force. And what was amazing was that from the far pastures, you could hear some of the moos calling back. And then they got stronger, and they were louder, and there were more moos. And then one by one, the cows from all the far pastures came out, and they literally lined up along this fence and touched nose to nose with Charger in greeting. It was an absolutely beautiful sight. Sanctuary is also home to Gizmo, who was brought in by an agricultural student who couldn't stand the thought of Gizmo being slaughtered. So I believe full-heartedly in animal rights. I believe in the rights of animals for their own sake. And I also understand the practical. And if we want to encourage that collective empathy, and if we want to create this social justice movement, as Kim has pointed out to earlier, it is vital that we show the world that there is no choice between us or the animals. We must show that our lives are very much entwined with the lives of animals, even those hidden from our view. And that we must show that our well-being is not separate from the well-being of animals. It's quite the opposite. We share the same destinies. Animals and humans largely share the same struggle, the need for safety, comfort, and a gentle hand. Well, the good news is that the solution to our struggles is the same. Empathy for animals is the inevitable extension of our empathy for each other. So moving forward, how we want to be with animals will depend on how willing we are to be with them, not as predator and prey, not as master and servant, but as friends, as family, and as partners. And by doing so, we lose absolutely nothing. But what we gain is tremendous. What we gain when we embrace our kinship with animals is our health, our happiness, our humanity. And we gain friendships that are irreplaceable. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Aysha?
A lot of the studies you mentioned are like case studies or case control studies. I was wondering if there have been any like randomized control trials that you know of that have been successful in showing how animals can be used as therapy and not just as like vivisection.
Yeah, no, these studies, there's so few of these studies, and as you mentioned, they tend to be small in general, and they're not necessarily the most rigorous of studies. I think there are a few studies by some prison institutions. Some programs are trying to do randomized controlled trials, but I don't know of any results. But we definitely need that. And even with the sociologist study on the slaughterhouse and the violence link, that's the only one of its kind that I have seen throughout my literature search anywhere in the world. And it's a large study, but we have no others. So it's very important for us in order to convince people outside of this room that we need to do more rigorous types of studies as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering, do you think that in many cases people form an attachment to a specific animal rather than animals. I mean, I know lots of hunters who really love their dogs, but are quite willing to shoot many things that move.
Yes.
So this empathy you're speaking of, is it really so all encompassing, or is it not directed to a specific individual even, or at least to a specific species rather than all animals?
I do believe that in general, the human species has this capacity to empathize with all animals. It's part of our biology, and I have every reason to believe that it will continue to grow as our species progresses. But you're right, people may have an affiliation for one animal, one species, and not the other. Part of why that happens, I think, is because of the labels we attach to these animals, the language we use. And that studies show that that can immediately squash our empathy for certain groups of animals. Just describing an animal as food animal can cut, there was a study that showed that it cut people's empathy almost immediately. And so there's a language component to that. That's not the only thing, but there is a language component to that. So it's important to change our language. But I also would suggest that not to think that empathy is a lost cause, because a lot of people do make that connection to larger issues through an individual animal. I've met many. My family, we became vegans overnight. This was 25 years ago. We were not vegetarians. We became vegan overnight because we saw our cats who we loved, and then we learned about what was happening to the cows. And I've heard the story from many people. So that alone is not enough to make a full social change, as Kim had suggested. And so, but it does have a role in that. And we need, what I also think is that as we start changing our policies and changing our laws, believe it or not, I think that's going to actually change our empathy as well. So it's a two-way street. Our individual behavior or individual thoughts can change law, but law can also change our individual behavior and our individual thoughts. So the more it becomes normalized to see animals not as tools, and more it becomes normalized to have compassion for animals, and maybe not eat as many animals, or any animals one day, hopefully, the more we will embrace that empathy, the easier it is for people to embrace that innate empathy as well. I hope that helped. Yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you so much, Aysha.